Webinar, practical tips on how to transition from traditional to modern testing practices. We have a great panel. It's going to be led by our DevOps analyst, Chris Riley, and some test engineering experts that frequently contribute to our blog, Ashley Hunsberger and Greg Sypolt. Again, my name is Bill, and I'll be moderating the session. As you heard, you can submit questions in the chat panel. And again, if you're having any technical difficulties as well. Q&A panel is the best place to submit your questions, and we will get to them at the end of the session, hopefully for the last 10 to 15 minutes. Again, we are recording this, and a few days after today's session, we'll go ahead and send out a link with the slides and the recordings. So, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started, and I'll pass it along to Chris Riley.
Great. Thanks, Bill, and welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm absolutely tickled to be joined by Ashley and Greg, two individuals who have lived the good and the bad of transitioning into modern testing, and they have a lot of great information to share about those experiences, really hands-on. So the format of today's webinar is basically going to go through, do brief introductions, and then we're going to jump right in with some specific questions and answers. Actually, I'm going to start with a introduction to kind of set the stage. So my name is Chris Riley. I am a DevOps analyst, which means that I was a bad software developer, and so instead of doing it, I have to talk about it. I basically cover the entire DevOps tooling industry and talk a lot with end-user companies on their movement to modern delivery chains. So let me have both Ashley and Greg do a brief introduction, starting with Ashley.
Hi, right now I am a QA product architect at Blackboard. You've probably heard of us if you attended college or any of our competitors. I work on general quality strategies across various aspects in testing, so not just automation, but accessibility, mobile, responsiveness, and any other type of testing you can think of. And I help establish best practices across all of those and rolling those out to our Scrum teams. And lately, I've been working on our future investments in quality and where do we see our quality at Blackboard going and what do we need, as well as stability in our automated UI tests.
Great. Greg?
Hi, I'm a senior engineer, aka automation architect at Gannett USA Today Network. For the last 6.5 years or more, I've been focusing around test automation strategy, best practices, training and mentoring QA staff on test automation, creating and deploying tools and testing frameworks for web browsers, functional APIs, and mobile native apps. And I mainly kind of work with a staff of about 22 QA people and also work really closely with all the devs at Gannett.
Excellent. Cool. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. But to start, I really want to frame why we're here. Prior to the webinar, when you registered, a lot of people responded with some questions, and I was very thrilled as I was reading through these questions to see that the audience really gets it. The audience really understands that there is a very big and significant strategic component to transitioning to a modern environment. And I think so much so that what we talked about doing is a blog post on a lot of the questions that came through, and any of the technical specific questions maybe we can hand over to Sauce. But I want to talk about that strategy a little bit and just quickly set the stage of why we are here and where we believe QA is heading, because obviously, there's some interest in the modern QA environment, and we have to acknowledge that it's there. And one of the things that I've seen a lot is this whole quote-unquote DevOps movement, where you may love the term, you may hate the term. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that the development space is changing, and everybody who's a part of that modern delivery chain needs to acknowledge that and hopefully be a participant in that, because if you don't participate, it happens to you. And so that's why understanding what's going on and what some of the changes are is important. And I use this term shift left as a major trend of where, especially with quality and QA, that everything is getting closer and closer to the developer, or closer and closer to when code is created. And that is not a small shift, because we're not used to it. But it really is great for QA. It's an opportunity to make quality assurance a first-class citizen and make sure that it's an element in the delivery chain that is in every stage, not just the end. And so as we make this transition, it's a journey. And I know a lot of people don't want to hear that, but it's a process. It requires strategy, and it's a journey. You never just are there tomorrow, and you're always evolving your delivery chain, as Greg and Ashley, I'm sure, can speak to. So now let's just jump into what we're going to cover and start with a question directed at our panel, and you guys can feel free to go back and forth on this. But let's just start simple. What does modern QA mean to you guys? Whoever wants to take it first.
I'll start first. This is Greg. I think modern QA really starts at, it starts around test automation. And it's more than just UI testing. It's really the whole entire continuous integration pipeline, which includes various types of testing, which starts from the infrastructure to where your DevOps team is spinning up servers and making sure those servers are working well. They also are writing automation scripts. And it also goes down the pipeline of writing unit tests and having developers be more responsible for that, and your integration API and all the way up to the end-to-end UI. And what this happens with modern QA is the lines start to be blurred between QA developers and your DevOps or your past teams, to where everyone is owning the quality of the project. And the teams are really focusing on how to really prevent bugs by building in the quality up front rather than finding bugs at the end. As these teams are working really closely together, they start to build out a better testing portfolio for that whole entire pipeline. And this really starts, following kind of the testing pyramid methodology by creating more lower level tests that are, typically fast and giving feedback to the teams at a faster rate. And at the end, having a smaller percentage of UI tests. And those smaller UI tests are really around your critical pieces of your application, and user workflows and stuff like that.
Ashley,
yeah. Just like Greg said, I see a shift within QA less as the tester, which I believe becomes more of your whole Scrum team. And I see them being more as facilitators. They're no longer the person you simply throw code at to make sure it works as soon as you're done developing. And like Greg said, you should be building in that quality up front. But how do you know what makes it high quality? And that's where your QA comes in. They can help drive both identifying acceptance criteria, designing what to test to meet that acceptance criteria, and therefore driving the quality of your code in general, because your developers are now seeing what has to be tested up front before anything's built. And the earlier you bring QA in, even before anything's developed, I think that is where we're seeing the modern QA going. Like you mentioned, the shift left approach, get it closer to that code. And there is going to be, I think, a more blurred line between QA and developers, like Greg said. Everybody owning the quality of the project, but seeing what is that role of QA shifting from the tester to the facilitator of quality.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. If I were just listening to this and perhaps a part of an existing QA team, I might see this as a little bit threatening. Do you guys feel the same way, or should teams look at it differently and look at it more of an opportunity?
From my experience, it's always going to be threatening from a manual tester perspective, but you kind of got to look at it the big picture as it is an opportunity to kind of, one, gain a new skill set to where, one, you're learning how to kind of test it a different way. Test automation doesn't like solve all the problems. There's still some manual testing, there's still some visual type of testing there, and you have to take it as an opportunity rather than being threatened with actually this whole transition and move into a modern QA.
Yeah, I don't see it so much as a threat, so much as like a new opportunity, not just from learning a new technical skill set. You might be set up where you're not technically going to be writing the tests. Your engineers might be doing that. But as the QA, you have to think of it, how do I look at my role earlier? What do I bring to the table? And really crafting that response, and that's your expertise area. I think QA really brings a very different perspective. We are very adept at thinking like the client, designing. Your automation is only going to test what you tell it to test, but I think QA is incredibly adept at thinking like that client. How are they going to use it? What is that client going to feel using it? And being able to design your tests that way. I think that's just a skill set that we bring to the table, but I think by moving us up earlier, we become that first-class citizen. We start teaching our team new skills too. And so it's just kind of reinventing yourself as QA, showing that value and quality and what it needs to do it up front.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, the ability to bring in the unique perspective. I've actually been harping on the idea a lot that QA is one of the few members of the team that have a holistic point of view. They really can see applications as a holistic thing versus developers seeing their part of the branch of the application and could be potentially limiting. So I feel like they're in a great position to be stewards. And I'm going to lead that into one of the, not questions, but a theme of the questions that came on early on, which seemed to be around staffing, seemed to be around hiring. How do you hire for the modern testing environment? How do you have to work directly with the DevOps people? What is the process there? Because obviously the other thing organizations are dealing with is they can't just start over tomorrow. They have to transition into this new mode of operation.
That's one of your challenges in general when you're making this transition. First you kind of got your existing staff, and you have to focus on, okay, from my existing staff, how do I make them successful as I move forward to, test automation? When I started Gannett 2 years ago, they was a completely manual shop. Making this transition over, I spent within 4 months, laying out this whole big, training program for all the, manual testers, and walking them through creating this baseline for the, the testers, and then kind of introducing and reviewing the technologies, and then start doing actual work exercises and coding and everything, and then showing how when you check in some code it is added to that pipeline. But the thing is, you will find some individuals that will kind of, I don't want to say rebel, but kind of push back because they love the part of being a manual tester. And so sometimes, they may leave, they may not. You just find where their value fits into the company. But as you start to seek for new people on your team, our big successful piece of it has been, really diving into universities and getting new grads and kind of saying, this is a great opportunity for you to kind of, one, start as a kind of an automation engineer and learn an application. And it's like the first step in your career path here at Gannett to where you can actually move in to be a developer after 6 months or 8 months or whatever it is, to where you feel comfortable and you kind of become more of a full stack developer and you have that testing mentality.
Yeah, and at Blackboard it's a little bit different. We really see value in what the QA can offer beyond automation as well. Of course, we look for people that have the ability to learn what they need to, But a lot of it is we're looking at the culture too and what we're looking for in our teammates. So if you're invested in the infrastructure and the test, you will be successful. It just takes time. If it's building that culture within your teams. If I'm hiring somebody, how do they interact? Are they able to build relationships with their developers, with their DevOps? I feel like the more you build that, the more you build trust, and then the more you get buy-in from the entire team to transition into automation in general. And the way we're structured is our engineers actually write the actual test, whereas our QA designs what needs to be tested. And so we work a little bit differently than Greg does at Gannett, but we've seen a lot of success that way. And so it's just different what you're looking for. I think it depends what works best for your team. If you find that you're somebody that's not willing and it's what you need, then you might need to figure out where they fit best within your team and utilize their skills that way.
Great. And I want to hang here for just a second because there's great questions coming around and more in depth in this topic, so you can tell that this is, a really big question, that perhaps people get what it means to build test automation, but not really how to build the team to support it. And one of the questions that really kind of hits me deep in my soul, because there's something called no ops, and the question is there no QA? Does the future modern delivery chain not have QA? And I want to start with Ashley, because I think, Ashley, your role in an organization, and me not being a QA person, it's hard to know what's normal or not, but your role specifically is not, it's not something a developer is going to do. They can't, because they don't have, the time, and it would just totally detract from what they should be doing, which is writing code. So maybe you can speak to that question.
I don't think QA will ever necessarily always go away, whether it's your engineer and your entire team that owns quality, or you're building quality in, or you have that separate QA person on your team. There will always be room for quality. I also think that, let's just look at it in a totally different context. I was at STTCon a month ago, and one of the keynoters, Karen Johnson, brought a really good analogy to mind. You might have a big event coming up. You want pictures of the event. Anybody can take a camera and point and click. But you probably want to hire that professional photographer to really capture what you're looking for. And I think the same can be said for quality. If you're looking for just somebody that can write a test on a line of code, write a unit test, write an integration test, great. I think any developer can do that. But where I think QA is really important is finding out those other things that we need to look at. What are the UI workflows that are really important and critical that you're discussing with your team? I think QA really helps drive that conversation in a modern world too. Other things that you might want to look at, how does it look, feel, more like UX testing almost. What is that user experience? These are things that your QA is incredibly skilled at doing, whatever means you choose to do it. And so I think there will always be that place. Like I said, automation, I fully believe in. It helps you get to where you need to be in a continuous delivery world. But I think there's always that human element, and the faster you get that feedback from your QA, I think the better off you're going to be.
Yeah, and I would add to that, there's the element of continuity. There's somebody has to steward the automation and build the consistency around how it's used. Otherwise, just like in DevOps, we've seen a lot of DevOps environments build awesome delivery chains only to fail 3 months later because they didn't anticipate the impact of those modern delivery chains. So that's great. And I think it's worth stepping back and saying, what do we really mean by traditional QA? I mean, obviously we said the word manual testing, which I think is a big element of it, but are there other aspects of quote unquote traditional QA?
Yeah, I mean, if you look back even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, everything was waterfall. You had your design, develop, test, release, all in a row. There was no circular feedback. And even at Blackboard, we used to have, everybody would develop, you'd kind of test while you're going, but then you'd have these huge monolithic test cycles that were all manual. We had, let's see, 45 to 50 people manually executing all of these test plans, and then you do another round and another round until you have ultimately no bugs or an acceptable amount of bugs to deliver and release to your client. This could take a year. It just depended on what you were building, what you were doing. And I think what we're seeing the shift in with, Agile, a lot of companies, and it was really surprising how many companies were still making that transition. Even we are still trying to get fully Agile. You see a lot of mix in between of waterfall, Agile. You're really starting to see that cycle shorten. You need to have your testing done in the sprints, or at least within your milestone, and then you're done. Like, you have to ship. And you're not going to be able to keep up with modern QA, with modern delivery of anything if you're going to keep doing these year-long releases, quarterly releases. You're just not going to be able to keep up. And you have to really shorten and tighten and consider what you're testing and how you're testing to be able to fit within that time frame as well.
Yeah, and I've actually even seen Agile environments that call themselves Agile, but really are really fast waterfall, which is still better than being full on waterfall. But you're absolutely right. That's a way to sustain. Now, there's actually a ton of questions around staffing in teams and so forth. So I think that's really fantastic, and maybe we can follow up with a blog post on those questions specifically. But I think it's important to start to talk about the execution and how you get there. And I'll lead in with Greg, because one of the things that's really impressed me about Greg's environment is how many tools that he's ended up adopting and using. And you don't need to speak specifically to the tools, Greg, but maybe you can talk about, the process of adopting tools, and if you are able to talk about some specific technologies that you use.
Yeah, again, I think the key of really being successful in this change to kind of is really start at really the infrastructure first and not think about infrastructure last. And to really make that really possible, especially when you're transitioning to test automation, is you really have to have that dedicated resource that is passionate about test automation and spreading that love across all your project teams. Because it's just not, like, you could be doing front-end testing, you could be doing API, and you have to have someone who's really dedicated and passionate about that. And so one of the things when I came out of Gannett, and like Chris was alluded to, is we have so many different tools that we use. And when I first came in here, to really get developers on board of writing tests, it's really about the importance of aligning the technologies. And so if your front end is written in JavaScript, align a testing framework for your end-to-end using JavaScript. Don't use like Ruby, because typically your developer wouldn't know Ruby and they have to go through all this learning. And so by aligning those technologies, it allows a better success rate in the sense of having kind of a full stack developer. And everybody can kind of share that responsibility of like quality. Everybody has a more efficient workstation. And and so at Gannett we probably have right now about 6 different UI testing frameworks that we go across all of our projects. And then our DevOps team has a lot of different technologies with using Chef and Datadog, and we use like tools like Datadog where we aggregate all the information to kind of create these KPIs and key performance indicators that understand the status of the team's overall pipeline status, if like when things are being checked in and tested. But when you're doing this whole process of the transition, you have to always think that everything needs to be scalable, and that starts from onboarding new employees to the existing staff, and cross-team training and innovation and deploying these processes and policy changes, because it starts with best practices and making sure everybody's on the same page when they're actually physically coding. And never be afraid to fail forward and try new technologies. Just don't get pigeonholed into one technology. That's the one thing again is if we're constantly always changing. If we find another technology that will work for us, we'll do that. And for like a good example with us is iOS native apps. And within the last 4, we've changed 4 times with the testing framework from the UI, and we're right now currently using Gray for our front end. It's been really successful for us. But it all starts around building that culture, and everybody, really embraces that freedom, responsibility, and accountability, and I think that really helps as you're making that transition forward.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I like what you say about preparing for the future, V next, and that's, I think what gets to the point early on is that it's a journey. Don't expect to be, at some point, turn around and say, okay, I'm done, I can leave here, my job's done. It's a continually ongoing thing. So the questions coming in, I'm actually pretty staggered at the number of commentary type questions that are coming in. I think that'll be useful going forward. But one of the things, going back to the team, and for my curiosity, because I think it's come up, and do titles change? I mean, are fundamentally the roles in the QA organization changing? For example, we've used the term QA, but maybe the more accurate term is QE, quality engineering, or is there more strategy functions? So what have you guys seen?
From our standpoint, it's been a couple things. We've been around, going from a quality engineer to an automation engineer. Lately, it's been more of a software developer and test. Because we're hiring people straight out of college with no experience, and it's their first opportunity to really get into an actual software development project. So lately it's been around software development and tests for us.
Yeah, I think for our automation team, we're looking at really just they're just automation engineer or senior automation engineer. The team members for the QA embedded in the Scrum team, they're still technically our analysts, but as they pick up skills and everything, to me a title is a title. If you're interested in something, learn about it, pick it up, show you've shown a level of adopting it, and if we need to change the title, then we'll change the title, I guess.
I love that point of view, because I guess if you're hiring to a title, then you're actually missing the culture element. And the word culture is thrown around left and right. And I think from what I've heard, people say, okay, I know what it means, how do I begin? But no matter what, it's there. I mean, if you don't create the culture, it creates itself. So it's still a very relevant thing to talk about. And if you're always hiring to a title, you might miss that. So
yeah,
one of the
I would say not hire to the title, hire towards the technology that aligns with your project. Like at Gannett, we're doing kind of a new universal web, and we're changing all the technologies that we're using, and we're trying to find people that would fit that technology need rather than title.
Great. All right. So and forgive the audience, we've deviated a little bit from the slides, but we're really following the flow of the questions coming in, so that's the reason why. Now I'd like to talk more, again, back at the implementation and the execution. And one of the things that I've seen that's very important is the ability to get quick wins. So where do you start? How do you get a quick win? How do you show that you've moved the needle forward in terms of moving faster and fewer bugs?
Really, it starts really changing the culture from that standpoint, and bringing everybody together to where, and kind of driving, saying everyone owns the quality. It doesn't really start at just QA only. Rather than that whole approach is we got a wall or a line of sand where just, I've completed all my code, now it's still over the QA. It's now bringing it together to where it's not a QA team, it's a project team. And I think that is one piece of where it's a huge win. It was a huge win for us to where everybody felt, they had a little bit more pride of actually, they wanted to see if tests were failing. That's been really successful for us. From that standpoint, from your traditional to kind of that modern type of QA.
Yeah, so recently we just rolled out some what we call pre-commit tests, which are tests that you want to run before you commit your code. And what we found is that we were able to show where we're identifying regressions way earlier, and I mean by as much as 2 weeks that we would have otherwise caught them. And by showing, a specific example of something that we've caught because of these tests, that's a huge win for us to get more and more buy-in on automation from our engineering, from our directors. Like, this is important. We're catching these things super early, way earlier than we ever would have. And that's been a really big win for us, even just as small as running a pre-commit test. And these are really just like a really small, critical, UI workflow that we have. So that's been a big win for us. And as Greg alluded to, the other shift that we have seen that's been a really big win with us is everybody taking ownership of quality. Engineers, for their pull requests, they'll pull down each other's branch. They'll test them out manually, even have the QA pulling down their branches, testing really early. And we've just seen a lot more involvement from the entire team on that front, and it's been great.
Now, would you say that that is one of the biggest motivations right there is going after something new, a new strategy, seeing it executed, and being able to deliver results? Because one of the problems is evangelizing this across the team. Again, being that steward, are there other ways to kind of socialize and share this so that you can get the buy-in to move even further?
Yeah, and I think one of the tenets of any team is like share your successes, because the more you share your successes, then you're going to get that buy-in. You're going to show people and be able to evangelize even more how important things are and that they work, and let's try this. And people, once you start sharing that with your team and beyond your team, you really start to see a shift in mentality, I think, within your greater department.
Yeah, and to add on to that, I think the biggest thing that we've really been trying to do this year is kind of build, KPI dashboards of a project, and this key performance indicator is it shows, okay, every time someone physically checks in a piece of code, it's passing 90% of the time. But if anything kind of drops below 90%, there's that indicator, and everybody wants to kind of keep that percentage saying, why did the build break, So it's that ownership across from building to even down to test, or saying, okay, how can we optimize this whole, continuous integration pipeline? And we have this big visualization dashboard that we've been building from, really detailed information, and everybody has that visual aspect of looking at this dashboard and trying to figure out ways to improve everything, and I think that's really helped us also.
Great, which also means that everybody needs to be paying attention, everybody needs to be involved, and really what I've seen is QA needs to step up. If you're not going to start delivering your wins, then you can't expect to number one, control the process, control what happens to you, but also do some of the things that you want to do. I think we've covered a lot of some of the challenges around this, and we talked a lot about hiring a team. The questions coming in, there's been a clear bifurcation between purely strategy and purely technical. So definitely this webinar is more on the strategy side. But at this point, anything that you guys see as being like some major roadblocks, either strategic or technical, that you've had to face, or maybe some of the ways to approach the most common challenges to making the leap forward?
I think the leap forward is real-time analytics, which I was just kind of talking about. I think if you have that real-time analytics of the health check of your whole project, that helps teams to kind of, one, evaluate how they can be better and how to optimize the whole process. And I think another challenge into the whole thing, kind of as you're making this transition into test automation or just the whole monitoring QA, is the buy-in to the existing staff and how does that benefit them. So you have to find people that are really passionate about QA, or people that are really passionate about test automation. As myself, I'm very passionate about test automation, and I love learning about new tools. Anytime I hear something new, I'm always going out and kind of playing around with it and seeing how it would actually fit into one of my teams here at Gannett. So that's kind of the challenges, is finding those people that are always looking for ways to innovate how to be better.
Yeah, I think another challenge I've seen is that, it takes resources. Like any UI automation is going to take resources, and it has its risks. And they can be a little slow, but once you've gotten even a little bit of buy-in from your team, I think you start to see, oh, we need to test everything. And there's comfort in thinking that you have 100% UI automation coverage, but honestly, it's just not realistic or practical. And that kind of makes, you know, your typical test pyramid feel mythical sometimes, as people keep wanting to add more and more UI coverage, but you really have to be vigilant and careful about what you're testing. You know, 20% of your tests should catch 80% of the things, not the other way around. And you really want to be careful about what you add into that suite. And I think it's really easy to see it balloon as people say, oh, just because I can, I should. That's not the case, and that's a really big challenge to overcome.
I think another challenge to add to that is really like, what's the right coverage? You know, what should I really be testing? You know, like when you make that like transition, I've had some lesson learned of like, it's just automate everything manually, or it's automate everything that's complex. But I think Dave Hefner made a great comment of when we was at STP, and when someone asked him that question, it's what makes your company money, and focus on those critical pieces and make sure that you have a really robust type of testing harness around that. And it might not even be test automation. It could be, you know, kind of ad hoc testing, or, you know, any type of like testing that will help you, but make sure that your critical pieces that make you money, you have some type of good coverage around it.
That's great. Yeah, and I think that there's an overall theme, and I'll say it, this is purely my opinion, but there is a little bit of tough love for the QA team, because what I've seen is that those QA teams that are most successful of changing how they do what they do and getting more efficient is the QA team took the initiative, and they took risks, and they jumped in, and they were assertive and aggressive. And I think that has to happen, and there's really no excuse for not kind of inserting yourself into the conversation and participating when you see the opportunities. And there's a ton of great ways to do that, everything we've talked about today, and the tools that you can adopt. So anyways, so let's take this last question, and then we can start to go into some of the QA, even though I did my best to try to roll it all in. I will say that anybody who had a very kind of technical specific question, please refer to the Sauce Lab blog, because Greg and Ashley are regular contributors there, and they have, the bell was going off every time I saw a question. They have very specific answers to all of these. For example, Greg has a blog post on KPIs, and Ashley has blog posts on building a strategy and strategy framework. So any of those specific questions, go there. Now, starting with Greg, what do you want the attendees of this webinar to leave with? I mean, it's either an action plan or a state of mind, but where should they go next? What is the biggest takeaway?
I guess it really starts, if you're making that transition from kind of a traditional QA to a modern QA, is, you know, if you have the capability, get someone that is a dedicated resource that's 100% focusing around automation strategies and talking to the developers and with all the QA teams, and kind of shaping out and evaluating what tools to bring on board. And, you know, there are different tools out there, and so I think the best approach to really get everybody to buy in is really the technology alignment. I think that's really an important piece. You know, if you're doing Java, do something around Java. Don't pick something completely in a different stack. That just really creates this line, or kind of shuts the doors with all the teams not working together. But I think that's a great start, you know, trying to find someone who's dedicated. And if you don't have that dedication, you know, I took that opportunity where at one point I was a QA lead. I've been a software engineer in the past, and when we started doing test automation, there wasn't a role of automation architect. I took that opportunity to kind of show my skill sets and how I could provide all these different technologies, and I just took one particular test and kind of then, you know, kind of automate it and kind of show that return on investment really quickly, and, you know, demo it to people. And that's kind of the same thing we do here at Gannett, is take something and, a little piece like an amateur or an ad call and say, okay, how can we physically automate this, and then show it to everybody, and then kind of broadcast that out to the whole teams.
Great. Ashley?
Yeah, from my perspective, I think the biggest takeaway is start with quality first. Once you start looking at how you can introduce quality and build quality in, then I think the automation falls into place, because then your whole team starts to look at, well, how do we implement this and still get this done in time? Well, it's not going to happen necessarily manually. And, great, if you are willing and able to sit there and learn to do the automation, awesome. Otherwise, you provided a path forward for your team to help build in these tests. And I think that's it will come, it will fall in place. I started extremely manual. I'm still learning a lot. But it's having that willingness to learn it and moving forward, and finding great mentors and showing people what you're doing or trying. And once you show them that you're willing to learn, you're going to get a whole lot more help from really smart people on your team.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and your journey is also fantastic. I think up to the latest, you guys did a training at STP, right, where you're focusing on the technical, very detailed technical bits, which is great. Okay, good. I did what I wanted to do. I wanted to get as close as possible to having enough time to do some specific Q&A, and Bill, of course, feel free to jump in as well. But I know Greg and Ashley looked at some of the early questions. I want to see if you guys had any of those that really stood out to you that you'd like to address.
I guess I think I've hit on it a couple times. People are asking, recommendations of automation tools. Like I say, find a tool that really aligns to where, one, aligns with your developers, to where if you do hit, kind of roadblocks, if they're efficient in like JavaScript, they can really help you out, and it's really like they see that initiative, and seeing that initiative from someone that might be a manual tester or is somewhat technical, they're kind of making that strides, and I think that's going to be a huge win, regardless, I think, for sure. I think that's on a lot of those pre-questions on there of how to pick a tool, and I think that's the best way to start.
Yeah. Yeah, and the thing is there's a lot of choices. I mean, tools like Sauce Labs, and you have to put it all together. And I think what both of you said that was very important and resonated with me is you should embrace the technology. You shouldn't be afraid, but be prepared to adapt. So you have to be not only agile in your testing processes, you also have to be agile in the way you operate, right?
Yes.
Absolutely.
I think there was another question.
Perspective as well.
There's another question here, and I think I wrote a blog post on this, is like, how much is a human element removed from the most automation transitions? I do definitely feel like as you move to test automation, you lose that visual perspective of testing. I'm walking through the application with a test script, but visually it doesn't see if CSS is kind of like broken, kind of overlaying with each other. And I think some of the new tools that is out there, like Applet Tools, that does a lot of like baseline on imaging and having kind of the new image and then does a diff to see if there's a difference there, definitely brings that perspective of what a manual tester used to provide. And so you can actually pipe that into your existing like Selenium test as you're walking through a test and taking snapshots of things and then creating this comparison. It kind of brings that back into a full circle again to where that human manual tester was kind of seeing. And I think that's a great way as we move forward with test automation.
Yeah, and I think that you'll always have that, that visual that you need, right? But I think a lot of that falls in your definition of done in an agile world, as well as your acceptance criteria. And you kind of still get that feel of how does this app feel to me through your design reviews. You still need to absolutely look at your application each sprint that you're delivering. I will always say that, even though, yes, automate your tests for what makes sense, especially the ones that you want running over and over again. But, within that sprint, how is your design review going? Has the developer looked at what they built? They should. No matter how much automation you have in place, you should still look at it. You just might not be looking at it 6 months down the road where your automated scripts can tell you how it is.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, the personal relationship with the application, which ultimately leads to a personal relationship with the customer at the end of the day. One thing we didn't talk a lot about, and we got some questions around, was on continuous delivery, continuous integration, infrastructure. You know, we have containers now, we have all this other stuff. And the good news is that all the tools we use usually have integration points with all this stuff. Like you mentioned, Apply tools for perceptual diffs. Sauce Labs has an integration with that. There's an integration with GitHub. They're all over the places. But it is important, and correct me if I'm wrong, isn't it important for the QA team to also have a good understanding of what those modern processes are, and maybe even the infrastructure that's being used?
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand the whole infrastructure and the workflow of that whole process. You know, from a developer checking in code, what happens from that standpoint downstream of the pipeline, right? If something goes wrong, you know, would they understand what tools to look at and that integration there? And could they actually reproduce it locally on their machine? I think that's a huge piece too, is as you're talking about this too, is are you able to kind of replicate things as you're building stuff with this continuous integration? In the past, in traditional, you know, someone would spin up a server for a manual tester. You would go do some stuff, and then you're like, hey, I found these bugs. And traditional world, you kind of using more of the DevOps, or where you might be using like a chef script to spin up an instance out on the cloud, like Amazon, and then you do all the testing yourself, and then you spin it back down after you're done with it. That's where it's changing a little bit, and I feel like that's where QA will get a little bit more, you know, involved.
Great. Yeah, it's a fragmented market. I mean, there's no doubt. There's a lot of opportunities out there, which in terms of technology, and it's both good and bad. And the other thing I'll say is that there's not a one-size-fits-all. So for your team, you have to know what's going to work for your team, and maybe you don't get to start with automation first. Maybe you really need to address culture and team structure, or get buy-in from your leadership prior to that. Great. Well, Bill, did you have any that you'd like to specifically address? I think we're coming close to the end here, but I do want to leave opportunity for some other specific questions I may have missed.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Chris. There is an interesting question here, and again, I know we've covered this, but maybe we can kind of tease out a few bullet points around it. But David asks, you know, it sounds like the primary difference between traditional and modern is manual testing versus automated testing, and I think that there's some more nuance to that really, Ashley mentioned the fact that waterfall is kind of, you know, this very serial process, and it can have both automated and manual testing in it, where modern is going to be much more cyclical, and again, we'll have a role for both automated and manual. But you or the panelists want to speak to that a little bit?
Sure. I actually really agree with what you're saying, Bill. You know, to me, I'm not thinking so much the tooling so much as when QA occurs as far as traditional versus modern. Because I do feel like whatever world you're in, the tooling will fall into place to meet your needs. I just think that in the modern world, you're going to see, you have to have the automation to be able to meet that shift left where QA is up front. Otherwise, you're never going to make it to delivery. Or you do deliver and you just don't test it.
All right. I'd add to that, actually. Sorry, I'd just quickly add to that it's, what I've seen is it's also a mentality shift of what's more important to you. Is it more important to get a specific release out the door, or is it more important to focus on the customer, the company's bottom line and the customers? And I think that the mentality has gone more and more to support the business. Don't just think about what you're doing specifically, support the business, and everybody has the shared objective of growing the usage and quality of your application.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that we continue to challenge is people still put a hard deadline on everything, but everybody wants to build in quality at the same time. And the main focus is like you do not want to affect the end user's experience. And so if you have a hard deadline, it makes it really difficult. And so you have to also kind of always be very vocal in those meetings to where it's like, well, we can get to that deadline, but if, your quality might be affected by that. And do you really want to affect the end user's experience by just rushing something out the door and actually just taking an extra couple days and making sure you're doing everything the right way? Like with a definition of done and making sure you've finished everything you needed to rather than just meeting that deadline.
Yeah, after all, the definition of DevOps is not just faster, it's higher quality as well. So just faster means technical debt, but you have to ensure that it's faster with higher quality, not less. Great.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So
well,
Bill,
I think this has been I think it's been a terrific conversation, and when we send out the follow-up email with the link to the recording and the slides, we'll also include links to some of the blog posts that you guys are referred to. In fact, there's one called The Definition of Done, or what is your definition of done? I think that was from Ashley. And here you go. Here's some additional resources that everyone can take advantage of. So unless there's anything further, I think we're pretty much to our full hour, and I want to thank Ashley and Greg and Chris for a very lively conversation, and we look forward to the follow-up.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, guys.
All right. Make it a good day. Bye-bye.